The conference room was a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city skyline, where only the most powerful men and women in the company ever gathered. On this particular morning, tension rippled through the air like static. At the center of the room sat a gleaming engine, not just any engine, but a prototype worth millions, designed to change the industry forever. The CEO had personally invited the top engineers and investors to witness its unveiling, expecting applause and admiration. Instead, what he got was silence, confusion, and the faint, embarrassing whine of a machine that refused to start. The CEO, a tall man with slick back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes, tried to mask his frustration, but as hour after hour dragged by, his mask began to crack. His voice grew sharper, his temper shorter, until finally, even the experts shifted nervously under his glare. "Do you mean to tell me," he snapped, pacing in front of the dead machine, "that I've poured millions into this project, and not a single one of you knows why it won't run?" His words echoed off the walls, bouncing around the polished table where executives sat stiff and uneasy. In the corner of the room, unnoticed by most, the janitor mopped silently. His name was Elias, a man who had given 2 decades of his life to the company, cleaning its floors and emptying its trash without ever being acknowledged as more than part of the background. That day, he hadn't planned to bring his son with him, but circumstances had left him no choice. The boy, no older than 14, stood quietly at his father's side, clutching his backpack, his dark eyes fixed on the mysterious machine that had baffled the so-called geniuses. The boy's fascination did not escape the CEO's notice. He turned suddenly, his sharp eyes landing on the child, and smirked. "What's this?" he asked loudly, making sure everyone in the room heard. "Elias, you brought your helper along to fix my $1 million engine. Maybe he can succeed where the professionals failed." Laughter broke out around the table, not the laughter of joy, but the cruel, dismissive kind that stung more than any insult. Elias lowered his gaze, humiliated, but the boy didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the machine, studying it with the quiet intensity of someone who saw more than anyone else in the room. "Why don't you fetch us some coffee, kid?" the CEO added mockingly, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Engines like this require brains." Note a broken bar. He let the sentence trail off, but the meaning was clear. The boy was just a janitor's son. He didn't belong in a room filled with investors and engineers. The boy's small hands curled into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. Inside, however, something stirred, not anger, but a fierce determination. He had grown up around machines, spending hours in junkyards with his father's old friends, tinkering with broken radios, bicycles, and car parts until they hummed back to life. To him, machines weren't puzzles, they were conversations waiting to be understood. And right now, that silent, stubborn engine in the middle of the room was speaking to him louder than the mocking voices ever could. Meanwhile, the engineers continued their debate, flipping through blueprints, arguing over failed calculations, and shaking their heads in defeat. The CEO's patience thinned with every passing minute. His dream project, the invention that was supposed to put his name in history, was slipping away in front of his investors. He pounded his fist on the table, his voice rising like thunder. "If this doesn't run by the end of the day, we all go down. Do you understand?" The boy's heart pounded. He could hear something none of them did, the faint misalignment, the hidden rhythm inside the machine's silence. He couldn't explain it, not in the language of engineers and executives, but he knew. Deep down, he knew what was wrong. And though the room was filled with power, titles, and wealth, it was the janitor's son who felt the answer burning in his chest, waiting for the moment when he would finally step forward. The boardroom was on edge. Engineers taped their pens against their notepads, sweat forming at their temples as the engine sat lifeless, a monument to their collective failure. The CEO paced like a lion in a cage, each step heavier than the last. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than the one before it, each second another nail in the coffin of his reputation. His eyes darted from one nervous expert to another, and when no one gave him the answer he demanded, his gaze finally landed on the boy again. The janitor's son stood still, his eyes fixed on the prototype as if nothing else existed in the room. His father noticed the way his son's fingers twitched slightly, The way he leaned in almost unconsciously, like a musician drawn to the sound of an instrument out of tune. Elias put a hand on his son's shoulder, a quiet warning, but the boy shook it off. Something inside him burned too strong to ignore. "I think I know what's wrong," the boy said, his voice steady but soft. Every head in the room turned at once. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, as if on cue, laughter erupted loud, cruel, and echoing off the glass walls. One of the engineers snorted into his hand. Another leaned back in his chair, smirking. But it was the CEO who laughed the loudest, slapping the polished table with the palm of his hand. "Oh, this is rich," the CEO mocked, wiping imaginary tears from his eyes. "Gentlemen, forget the millions we've spent, forget the experts. Forget the best minds money can buy. The janitor's son has cracked the code." The room roared again with laughter, but the boy didn't flinch. He didn't even look away from the engine. His confidence unnerved them more than his words. "I said," the boy repeated, louder this time, "I think I know what's wrong. Let me try." The CEO's laughter died into a sneer. "Try? Do you have any idea what this is? This isn't a toy car in your daddy's garage. This is cutting-edge technology. A child like you couldn't possibly let him try," Elias interrupted quietly, his voice firm, surprising even himself. For years, he had swallowed insults, endured disrespect, and worked in silence. But watching his son mocked the same way lit a fire in him. He looked the CEO in the eye. "You've tried everything else. What's the harm?" The CEO hesitated, his pride warring with his frustration. Finally, he scoffed and waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. Impress us, boy. Make me regret not putting you on payroll." His tone dripped sarcasm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, one he tried to hide. The boy stepped forward, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He knelt beside the machine, studying its polished frame. His hands hovered over the toolbox on the floor. And then, with surprising confidence, he selected a wrench. The room fell into a tense silence, executives leaning in despite themselves. He pressed his ear closer to the machine, listening the way others might listen to a melody. His fingers traced along the wiring, then paused. He adjusted a loose valve, his movements precise and sure, then tightened a connection hidden beneath a panel. The experts exchanged uneasy glances. Every adjustment the boy made seemed small, almost insignificant, yet deliberate in a way none of them could dismiss. Minutes passed. The CEO crossed his arms, pretending to be bored, but his eyes never left the boy's hands. Elias stood rooted in place, torn between fear of his son failing and pride that he had dared to try at all. Finally, the boy wiped his hands on his father's rag and stood. His chest rose and fell with the weight of the moment. "Try it now," he said. No one moved. The CEO raised an eyebrow, then gestured sharply to one of the engineers. "Well, humor him." The engineer hesitated, then pressed the ignition. For one agonizing second, the room held its breath, and then, with a roar that shook the table, the engine came alive. It purred, strong and steady, a flawless rhythm filling the room with raw power. The noise was music, beautiful and undeniable. Gasps filled the air. The same men who had laughed now leaned forward, eyes wide in disbelief. One engineer muttered under his breath, "Impossibly broken bar." Another simply stared at the boy as if he were seeing him for the first time. The CEO's smug expression melted away, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years, a shock. He struggled for words, his jaw tightening as he realized what had just happened. The boy didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply stepped back to his father's side, his hands stained with oil, his eyes calm. The engine kept purring, each smooth cycle a reminder that it was the janitor's son, not the million-dollar experts who had done the impossible. For the first time in his life, the CEO found himself speechless. The engine continued to roar, steady and strong, filling the glass room with a vibration that seemed to rattle more than just the floor beneath their feet. It rattled egos, pride, and reputations. The executives who had once laughed now sat frozen, their mocking smiles wiped away by the undeniable truth humming before them. The janitor's son had done what their degrees and salaries could not. The CEO stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck bulged. His pride, once towering, now crumbled beneath the weight of that sound. He had mocked the boy, ridiculed his father, and turned the entire room against the mate, and yet here they were, the two figures he considered lowest, standing taller than anyone else. The humiliation was unbearable. An investor, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit, broke the silence first. She leaned forward, eyes locked on the boy. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice low but filled with awe. Others joined in, murmuring questions, unable to comprehend how a child had unlocked the secret to their multi-million-dollar project. The boy shrugged, wiping his hands again with his father's rag. "I just listened," he said simply. "The machine wasn't broken. It was a broken bar misaligned. You were forcing it to run when it was telling you what it needed." His words, plain and unpolished, carried more weight than all the technical jargon that had filled the room hours before. The CEO snapped out of his stupor, desperate to regain control. "Nonsense," he barked, though his voice cracked slightly. "He just got lucky." I guess ain't nothing more. But even as he spoke, he knew no one believed him. The engine ran too smoothly, the boy's confidence too steady, for anyone to mistake it for chance. Another investor, an older man with silver hair, leaned back and smiled faintly. "Luck doesn't make an engine run like that. Talent does." His gaze shifted from the CEO to Elias and his son. "And talent deserves recognition." The room erupted into quiet agreement, murmurs of approval spreading like wildfire. For years, the CEO had commanded this space, his word unquestioned, his arrogance tolerated because of his wealth. But now, the balance had shifted. Every pair of eyes, once fixed on him, now looked to the boy and the janitor's son who had humbled them all. Elias felt his throat tighten. For decades, he had been invisible, treated as nothing more than a shadow on the edge of power. Now, his son stood in the center, shining with a brilliance no one could deny. He placed a hand on his boy's shoulder, his eyes glistening with quiet pride. "Where did you learn that?" one of the engineers finally asked, half in disbelief, half in admiration. The boy looked down for a moment, then answered with honesty. "I spend my time fixing broken things. Radios, old cars, bicycles, a broken bar. I don't know the words you use, but machines make sense to me."